Need psychotherapy online or in person? Check out tinyurl.com/THT psychotherapy. The George Brassey Podcast is made possible with funding provided from Brassey Global Strategies, LLC, a leading political consulting, public policy, government affairs, and research firm. Are you interested in running for elected office? Need advice? Call or email George, 708-769-5015. Brassey Global Strategies 1@gmail.com.
Before we get to the interview, I just want to tell you about our newest sponsor, Union Signs and Printing. Union Signs and Printing is a union sign shop located near Chicago, Illinois, that specializes in the production of corrugated plastic lawn signs used in applications ranging from political and election usages to unions, schools, and businesses. They also produce a vast array of other products, including American-made, union-printed t-shirts, banners, bio cards, literature, door hangers, business cards, and trifold. Get a hold of Union Signs and Printing at 815-740-1688 or find them on the internet at unionsignsandprinting.com. And don't forget to tell them you heard about their services on the George Brassey Podcast. Hey everyone, it's George. I'm so glad to welcome my friend State Senator Patrick Joyce, the 40th Senate District, serving us in Springfield. Senator Joyce, thanks for coming on the podcast.
Thanks, George. Great to be here.
Tell the listeners a little bit about the footprint of the 40th District.
40th District, we're up in Chicago Heights right now. It runs through Park Forest, South Chicago Heights, down into Eastern Will, Manhattan, Wilmington, Braidwood, New Lenox. Then it goes into Kankakee County, all the way to the west edge of Kankakee County, and then just a small part of southeast Grundy County.
Senator Joyce, tell the listeners a little bit about your backstory about where you grew up at in the 80th District and who your dad was.
Okay. I am in the very southwest part of the 40th District, and with that, I grew up on a farm. I still live on the farm that my great-grandfather built in 1890. So it's a fourth generation family farm. Grew up in a farm community farming. Started a small business about 25 years ago. It was a composting business that's still going today. But the background I grew up in, very small rural school. Went to college for agribusiness, so everything was ag-related in my life. Then when I got into small business and started learning a lot more about business, things kind of changed a little bit for me. My father was in the Illinois Senate for 16 years. During that time, he started in, I think, 74. And in 74, I was 12. So I grew up in my teenage years was knocking doors and going to parades. And guess what? Now I'm knocking doors and going to parades. I said I was never going to run for office, and up until I was 57 years old, that worked out real well for me. But I had an opportunity almost 3 years ago when there was an opening coming for the 40th District. I had several people reaching out to me and thought that'd be a good fit. And at that point, my kids were grown up. I've had a business that I've had for 25 years. This job takes a lot of time. And I thought that I was at a point in my life where I had the time to give that this job deserves.
When you think about the amount of time the job takes, what are some of the issues that you're working on in Springfield in the first 2 years that you've been there?
Well, my first year, one of the first bills that was a major bill for me that I carried was bringing a natural gas pipeline to Pembroke Township. And Pembroke Township is one of the poorest communities, not in Illinois, but in the country, and with very limited resources. And it's something that should have happened 30 years ago. And it was amazing to me how much controversy there was on bringing natural gas to that community. needed to happen. We're still working on it. We got legislation passed that gave NICOR a path to bring that service to that community. Learned a lot about working a bill with that through the House and the Senate. So that one, clean water is a major issue. I know here in Chicago Heights, the infrastructure of your water system is old. And throughout the 40th District and throughout Illinois, and I think throughout the Midwest, clean, fresh water for everyone is going to be one of our biggest challenges over the next 20 years. And that's something that I deal with in every community, whether it be a small community with a underground well that the aquifer is drying up, or if it's the infrastructure of an antiquated system that needs to be upgraded.
What's that like to carry a bill from start to finish?
A lot of work. Bringing in all the stakeholders, I've found that the first thing you want to do in any legislation is find out who's going to be opposed and why. You know, when you find out why they're opposed and you bring them to the table, address their concern, I would say 90% of the work on a bill is done in a room with 5 or 6 people, stakeholders that are for and against the bill. All the work that you see on the Senate floor, the negotiations already been done. That's where all the work's done, is ahead of time, and making sure you bring in stakeholders that have concerns with it and address them.
You almost have to act as a mediator with the various stakeholders.
Well, you're constantly a mediator, yes.
When you talked about the issues in Pembroke, which is a very impoverished community, what were the issues that they were resisting, or what was the resistance at?
Well, couple different things. They were saying that we were displacing some people, which we were not. This pipeline, and it's not a pipeline. It's a 4-inch tube and going down to a 2-inch tube. And it was going to go in the right-of-way, the utility right-of-ways that are already existing. Also, the big concern was that we were bringing natural gas. And they think that the environmental community thought that natural gas is on its way out. Well, Illinois passed a clean energy law last year that said we would phase out natural gas by 2045. Now, every bill that any legislature passes, I think if you're going all the way to 2045, that's 20 years from now. There's going to be 10 more General Assemblies by then. Who knows where things are going? But I didn't think that this community needed to wait longer, another 20 years for this to happen. They were talking about community solar. Their electrical array out there is not equipped for the kilowatt hours that were necessary. So we couldn't bring in solar because they didn't have enough electrical grid. That was going to be a $30 million ask to upgrade their electric so they could get community solar. So again, how long do you want this community to wait?
Senator Joyce, you also mentioned the water in Chicago Heights. Can you talk a little bit about some of the issues you've been working on for us?
Yeah. One of the challenges that a couple different communities, Chicago Heights and New Lenox, had is the Illinois Department of Natural Resources does an allocation about every 10 years, and they review those allocations. And when Chicago Heights and New Lenox submitted how much water they'd be needing over the next 10 years, the Great Lakes Commission, who monitors how much water is being drawn out of the Great Lakes, then went through DNR and said, hey, that's too much. Well, if you can prove how much water you're going to be using, is it too much? I mean, documentation, and both Chicago Heights and New Lenox then provided documentation. But the biggest concern in Chicago Heights was they had almost 18% non-revenue water. Now, non-revenue water in layman's terms is leaks. That's a lot. But the challenge is, how do we get the money for the infrastructure for a system that has 18% non-revenue water? The federal government had an infrastructure bill that was just passed, and the state of Illinois have both stepped up in the last 2 years on dollars that are going towards lead pipes. Illinois is one of the leaders in having lead pipes that carry water. We're going to start addressing that as a state and as a federal government. So my job is to make sure that the community of Chicago Heights or New Lenox have access to those federal funds. I fight for those funds for those communities.
Senator Joyce, you also fought last year to help get us a DMV established temporarily at Prairie State College with Rep. DeLuca. Can you talk a little bit about that process and what you delivered there?
Sure. During the Black Lives Matter movement, damage was done to the DMV facility in Chicago Heights. Now, that facility needed some improvement on it way before that. And it was an opportunity in that kind of forced the issue as far as improvement. But we were going to be without services for 1.5 to 2 years. So we contacted Prairie State College and said, do you have any place in your campus that we could put in a long-term temporary facility so that we can provide service to the people of Chicago Heights? Because they were having to drive, frankly, to Bradley or to the northwest, and it was a large population that wasn't getting service. And Prairie State was a fantastic community partner. We turned a gymnasium into what looked like a state-of-the-art DMV facility and ran that for, I think, a little over a year. And then while the remodel was going on at the old DMV facility, and now that's all modernized and back running again. But, I really appreciate Prairie State stepping up to the plate and being a good community partner, and we were able to get that done.
Senator Joyce, you have an opposition this time around. I wanted to know if you'd share a little bit about, maybe if those people were listening, what do they get wrong about Senator Patrick Joyce?
Well,
what do they misunderstand about Senator Joyce?
I've been a family, rural, community-oriented person my whole life. I work and support members of both parties. I mean, if someone's doing a good job, it doesn't matter if they're a Democrat or Republican. I'm a firm believer in that. There's many Republicans I've supported over the years locally, as well as Democrats. If you're getting it right, you're getting it right. And that's the bottom line. There's going to be major cultural and racial differences when you're talking about the 40th District. You're in an urban, suburban, and rural setting. You got black, brown, white people throughout the district. You're going to have any issue that may be popular in one part of the district that is not popular in another part of the district. That's just going to happen in the 40th because of the demographics, because of the layout, because of what they do for a living. You have to be able to understand the perspective of each person in those given areas. Some people get mad when you're supporting something that they vehemently deny or don't believe in. That's okay. But people have lost touch with how to communicate, how to negotiate, how to understand someone else's plight or perspective. And anyone that wants to talk to me about an issue face to face, it drives me crazy. The keyboard warriors on Facebook. And it's very easy to do that. And when you sit and just take a calm approach and talk about the issues on what's really going on, we're able to communicate pretty well. And I'm not afraid to have that conversation with anyone. Will I agree with you all the time? No. But I'll definitely listen because I want to know your perspective too.
Senator Joyce, looking back at the last 2 years as our senator in Springfield, what has been your biggest accomplishment and what has been the area where you felt like you haven't had the change, you haven't been able to make the change that you want to make?
Well, I'm going to circle back to the Pembroke natural gas pipeline. And then also we're doing a lot of work on the Kankakee River. Both things are decades of underserved or neglected situations. And the Kankakee River is a lifeblood to the southern part of the 40th District. We draw water out of it. It's recreation. It's drainage for farm ground. Getting utility access to Pembroke was a major step that's been talked about again for decades. As far as something that maybe we didn't get accomplished yet, I'd like to see the expansion of some of our renewable portfolio to hydroelectric. We have a couple of different areas in the district that we could get that done. We're starting right now on broadband access. Broadband access is a major deal. Pandemic showed where we have deficiencies, and that can be from Chicago Heights to Essex, Illinois. You have a rural community that doesn't have connectability. You have areas that are underserved and unserved throughout the district. We started on a bill last year that's going to help capture $1.6 billion for Illinois for expansion of broadband to both unserved and underserved. And the way kids go to school now, that's an absolute must. We're not done with that yet. I'd like to see that expanded on, and that's something I'm very passionate about finishing.
Senator Joyce, the last question I always ask my guests are, what are 2 books that have been important to you as a person, and why?
The first one is called No One Ever Calls to Say Hello. And there's a couple different reasons why I read that book pretty early on in my life. It's a book written by Philip J. Rock, and Philip J. Rock was a Senate president in Illinois, longest serving Senate president. He was Senate president for, I believe, 14 years and served in the Senate for 22 years. Many of those years were with my father. I knew the Rock family and still know the Rock family. I saw J. Rock about a month ago. Good seeing him. We stay in touch. Phil Rock and my father were very good friends. And the book gives a lot of he served under people like the first Richard Daley, mayor, and Jim Thompson, the governor, George Ryan, the governor. I mean, the 22-year span and who he served under and how Illinois politics worked. And it's a insight with a lot of humor, but a lot of, I'm not one that's big into the Chicago politics scene. You want to read that book, you're going to get some insight as to that. And I knew the man personally. So that's one of my books. The other one that I've read a couple different times is The Firestorm at Peshtigo. And Peshtigo is a small town in Wisconsin. Everybody knows about the Chicago fire. And that one's written by Denise Guess, with a William Lutz, a historian. And it's a true story. The Chicago fire was in 1870, early 70s, 71, 72. At the same time, throughout the Midwest, in Minnesota and in all over the Midwest, we were in a major drought. And wood was the industry then. That's what built Chicago, was the wood. And the Great Chicago Fire killed only 200 some people. I say only, because in Peshtigo, where the wood mills were and where all this debris from the wood mills, this thing caught fire and killed over 2,000 people at the same time as Chicago Fire. And what a lot of people, this book points out, is that there was smoke in the air all over the Midwest that summer. And the Chicago Fire it's not the cow, Miss O'Leary's cow kicking over it. I mean, there were embers and dry, and everything was made of wood then, and the whole Midwest burned. And the firestorm is what's in the title. This thing created its own climate. It got so hot. They couldn't count the bodies. It cremated the bodies. And just how it's tied to Chicago history, William Ogden, who was the first mayor of Chicago, was one of the wood barons that had some of those mills. And towards the end of his life, almost went broke trying to help and recoup a lot of what happened up there. And it's just a very intriguing book on a part of history that nobody knows about.
Senator Joyce, tell the listeners a little bit about when you're up for re-election and how they can find you on the internet if they need to get a hold of you.
ElectPatrickJoyce.com and Facebook, it's Elect Patrick Joyce. We have an election in November. I think early voting starts in beginning of October. It's a little different for each county because we have Cook, Will, Kankakee, and a little bit of Grundy. But you can go onto our website and find out when you can do early voting. You can do mail-in voting. But November 8th is coming up quiet. It's only like 55 days away. So look us up. We'll be in your neighborhood soon. We're hitting a lot of doors right now. We're doing a lot of work on the campaign. happy to talk with anybody about it.
State Senator Patrick Joyce, thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
It was my pleasure, George.
Help George stay on the Chicago Heights City Council. Go and donate today at tinyurl.com/AldermanGeorge 2023. Need more George? Like his pages on Facebook. Friends of George Brassey PAC, Fifth Ward Business Alliance, Chicago Heights Bicycle and Pedestrian Resource Center, and the George Brassey Podcast.